Again, real anthroposophy and more on the shadow. The shadow inside the society, the shadow outside, and the macroculture, the shadow inside yourself. The opponents, the role of the opponents. The opponents provide resistance. They make the I have to work. Okay, if we're going to incarnate real anthroposophy, we have to work. And where? We have to work inside ourselves. That's why we have a science of the mind. That's why we strive to have a science of the mind. I'm going to be repeating this stuff till people get crazy from it. Another way to look at this is to call it the mystery of evil. Now let's take sort of something from a larger view before we narrow down and get into the nitty-gritty of us and what goes on and how awful it is, and etc., 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 etc. Okay. There are some lectures of Rudolf Steiner called From Symptom to Reality in Modern History. And I think it's in lecture 5, but I don't know exactly for sure. But Steiner says he's going to talk about the mystery of evil, and then he gives this kind of metaphor, and then you don't ever hear about it again. He talks about other stuff. It's like he drops this big hint into the puddle of our thinking, and why did he do that? Well, we're going to talk about that a little. Well, I might as well talk about it here because it's a big problem in this society. As a lead up to how we get meaning from this metaphor about the mystery of evil that Steiner dropped into the puddle of our consciousness. When Steiner spoke in Central Europe, he was by and large forced by the nature of the soul life of the individuals he was talking about to form the terms that he used, and people think it's really great. He created all these new words, and German allowed him to do this because you can add all this stuff at end and beginnings and make all this interesting stuff happen. And it's a wonderful thing. I'm not saying it's not a wonderful thing. But he was constrained by the fact that the majority of his listeners were still captured to a large degree by the intellectual soul. And in fact, one of his purposes was to educate people in the intellectual soul to the consciousness soul. And in fact, in the lectures called The Challenge of the Times, that's exactly what he says. He says that Central Europeans must be educated to the consciousness soul. He says English speakers are instinctively in the consciousness soul in their life of rights. Hello. And elsewhere, in the lectures to Workman, in 3 August, I think, 1923, he says Americans are natural anthroposophists. Now bring all that together and you can get an idea that there's something going on here that makes it possible for someone like me to come along and be an American and be blessed by the fact that I'm an American in terms of what I bring innately through my soul forces to the questions of existence that we consider are important in an anthroposophical point of view. So, again, when we read Rudolf Steiner, we have to realize that he was forming his concepts about his experiences. Now, those are two different things. The experiences that Steiner had were sublime, extraordinary. And anybody that's had real spiritual experiences, and I've had a few of those myself, it's very hard to talk about them because they are full. They are inescapably beyond language. And that's why in the learning about the imagination, Steiner tells us we have to learn to think in symbols because that's the way the spiritual world speaks, in symbols. So it's not language, it's symbols. Meditations on the Tarot is a discussion of a book that appeared around the 14th and 15th century in the form of a deck of cards or symbols. Okay? But Steiner couldn't give us what he experienced imaginatively or inspirationally or intuitively in the symbols, in the direct contact with the divine. A little bit he could, but not really. So part of his cognitive activity was to create language forms which we call the content of spiritual science, in which he could lead us in the direction of understanding the spiritual nature underlying the world in which we find ourselves and the spiritual nature of our own being. Now, this was a great work, there's no doubt about it. It required an extraordinary person, etc. Okay? But those language conventions that Rudolf Steiner used are not consciousness soul language conventions. When we're in the consciousness soul, we have to talk about different things and in a different way. Okay? So this is one of the reasons why there's a difference between America and Europe on these questions. This is important stuff. Think about it a little bit, okay? Get your head around it. Lots of problems come from the fact that Americans try to be Europeans in their soul life, and I've written about this and we'll talk about it. It's one of the mistakes that the shadow leads us toward. Anyway, to back all the way up to from symptom to reality, Steiner mentions the mystery of evil, and he says in a kind of metaphor of the intellectual soul language, he says, well, what we see as evil is not really evil in the sense that we see evil. I'm paraphrasing. So think of it this way. Imagine a train traveling on some tracks. And the train has purpose and it's going in a certain direction and it's going to get there. And that's a good. But a side effect of traveling on the tracks is that the rails wear out. What we observe is the wearing out of the rails, and because of our status as human beings and our stage in the evolution of consciousness, we perceive that as evil or wrong. But it's an indirect consequences of something that's the good. Okay? Now that's the intellectual soul language. He had to do it that way because that's where his readers were and his listeners. Okay, so let's jump into the consciousness soul way of talking about the same thing. We have lower chakras. Below the heart chakra are 3 lower chakras. These contain all kinds of appetites. We need these appetites. If there is to be a continuation of bodies for spirits to incarnate, human beings have to make babies. And to keep the human organism going, we have to eat food. And we have to process that food and we have to eliminate it. Now, all those lower chakra processes and the enormous psychic energies related to them are the train and the train engine. And they're traveling along, and they're going where they're going because it's absolutely necessary for the human being existence in the material world. And these forces are ruled by the mother. Surrender. Okay? So there we are. Now what happens? Well, when we are a little bit excessive, we eat too much. Look at me, I'm way overweight. You know, we fornicate too much, we do all kinds of things we shouldn't do in terms of the applying of those energies of the lower chakras. It wears out the rails. Those energy streams of the lower chakras wear out the human organism, and because of the relationship between all of that and the double, it brings about illness and death. And he hints at that in the lectures collected under geographic medicine. Okay? Let's stop. Come back for more.